Moccasin Trail, Chapter 1. Silently, in the hour between sunset and dark, young Jim Keith moved upstream, his flintlock in one hand and his last trap in the other. He walked with an easy, almost careless gait, yet not a twig snapped under his moccasins, not a branch swayed or a pebble rolled to show he had passed. His appearance was unusual even for the time, which was 1844, and the place which was the wilderness of the great Oregon Territory. He wore the leggings and fringed buckskin shirt of a white trapper, but his long, dark hair was braided like an Indian's, and an eagle feather was stuck into it. His eyes were not black, but so light a brown that they looked almost golden against his bronzed skin. Yet they had the Indian's wild, unsettled, wary look in them. One highly skilled corner of Jim's brain was furiously busy, receiving and digesting the information sent to it by his alert ears and constantly moving eyes. The magpie sounded off-key. Why? Was it what had scared it? How far away was it? Was it flying towards him or away from him? There was a broken limb bobbing in the current of the stream. What had broken it? Wind? Indians passing? Animal? What kind? How long ago? Yonder was a gnawed sapling, beaver sign. That made the third. Was it time to take to the water now? But all this noticing, remembering, judging, interpreting, deciding took place swiftly and automatically, without his ever giving it a conscious thought. Even as he changed his course in obedience to that gnawed sapling and moved soundlessly through the leafless underbrush to the stream's edge, his mind loafed among thoughts of flood and of warm fire, his horse and mule nibbling bunch grass back at camp, the moccasin he must mend tonight, and the good taste of beaver tail. Jim stepped into the icy water, swearing inwardly as the bitter cold penetrated the strips of old blanket he wore for leggings. It was as good a winter already, here in the mountain meadows above Powder River, though it was only October. Likely snowed up higher yesterday, he thought, and from the look of that sky it'll snow here tomorrow. Time for Tom and me to get movin', lessen we aim to winter here. Wished I could talk him into staying. If he heads back to Taos, ain't nothing for me to do but go back to Absaroka, on back to Crow Country. The thought made his brows knot, sent the familiar restlessness creeping over him. Was it really meant that he should go back to the Crows and settle down once more to be an Indian? He'd run away from them a little over a year ago, lonesome for his own kind, crazy for the sight of a white man. What had gone wrong? He waded on upstream, plagued by the uncertainties that had dragged at his life for weeks now, ever since Tom Rivers had said he was quitting the fur trade come fall. What would he do after Tom left? What would Tom himself be doing? Plenty of trappers had gone back east to the States, or taken up guiding wagon trains, or set up trading posts on the plains somewhere to sell meal and powder and calico to the bourgeois heading for Oregon. Tom might do one of those things, but Jim couldn't see himself doing any of them. He shoved the matter out of his mind and swerved toward the bank. His trained eye, that ceaselessly busy corner of his brain, had together selected the best spot for his trap. It was near the beaver's lodge, where a slide came down the bank into a pool created by the dam. He cached his rifle in a low branch and stooped to sink his trap, glancing as he did so towards the mud-splattered structure looming there in the fading light. A big lodge it was, 6 feet high and twice as broad. He smiled briefly, remembering the night he had once spent in a beaver lodge, listening to the footsteps and sullen grunts of 3 Sioux warriors prowling about outside looking for him. A lodge made a good hiding place, more comfortable than many another, though of course its only entrances being underwater, you had to get soaking wet getting there. But what of that if you kept your scalp? The trap was placed now in the proper depth of water. A stout, dry limb, hacked from a nearby cottonwood, made a good enough trap pole, and Jim drove it hard through the ring at the end of the 5-foot steel chain, into the gravel at the bottom of the stream, and through that into the mud and the solid stuff beneath, putting all his strength behind it. He tested it and nodded. It would take a man-sized beaver to yank that free. Still, they sometimes did it, dragging the trap after them onto the bank, and you'd be minus a pelt, unless you reached them before they could gnaw off the imprisoned foot. As an added precaution, Jim cut a small branch for a float stick to show him the position of the beaver's body, should it yank free but drown before it reached the bank. Then he splashed water over every place he had stepped on the bank and on the trap pole itself. When it was all finished, he arched a small willow shoot over the surface of the water, just above the trap's trigger, fastened it, and smeared it with castoreum, that powerful medicine made from the glands of other beavers, which he carried in the plugged horn slung from his belt. The strong, pungent smell of the stuff filled his nostrils as he straightened up, corking the horn. That ought to fetch him, he thought, if there's any left to fetch. He turned away, automatically touching for luck the string of blue beads and bear claws that hung around his neck. By gor, I need some luck tonight, he thought. We all do. Country's nigh trapped out. Retrieving his rifle, he waded back downstream, once more turning and twisting the problem in his mind. That was the whole trouble. The beaver were all but gone. With plenty of beaver, a man could live content day by day, needing neither bourgeois wagons to guide nor Indians to live with, needing no plans and no future, but only the broad land, the mountains, the streams, and the high meadows, the good, wild country, once choked with beaver dams, but now trapped clean out. The Humboldt, the Snake, the Upper Green, Pierce Hole and Jackson Hole, Wind River and Clearwater, all were finished. Even the Powder, where he and Tom had prowled for the last month, with only a few clues to show for it. Lifting empty traps every morning made a kind of emptiness inside you, too. He ran a hand back through the tangled lock of front hair that always escaped from his braids. As he did so, his fingers touched the 4 thin, slick scars that ran from his hairline down to his right eyebrow. That grizzly done a sight more than just tear me up a little, he thought. He wondered, as he had wondered so many times, how things would have turned out if it hadn't been for that bear's catching him. He'd never have grown up in the Crow village, that was for sure. He'd likely have gone back to the States after Uncle Adam died, or even if he'd gone on trapping it, would have been with white men, and he would never have got so mixed up as to which world he belonged to. He turned toward the bank and waded ashore at the same place he had first entered the stream. As he reached out to splash water over his trail, his buckskin sleeve hiked up, revealing the other scars, the bad ones, on his forearm. Twisted, cruel furrows blazed white on his brown skin, 4 of them running diagonally across the underside of his forearm. There were others under his shirt, sweeping down over his chest and belly in the same vicious curve. He moved into the forest and on downstream with his soundless tread, remembering the bear crashing into the camp on the Wind River that evening more than 7 years ago, remembering the yells of his uncle and the other trappers as they scattered the shots, the screaming horses, his own paralyzing fear. He was only 11 then, and a greenhorn. It had been less than a year before that he'd run away from home to follow his uncle, and like a greenhorn he'd floundered away upwind, through the underbrush and over the boulders, every move he made bringing his scent more clearly to the wounded and infuriated grizzly roaring in pursuit. Within minutes it had all been over. The bear hurtled through the last thicket, just as his own legs gave out with fear and exhaustion. His heart knocking wildly, He swung about and raised his rifle. For a fraction of an instant, he stared through the gun's sights into a red and glaring eye, then squeezed the trigger. As the gun roared, the bear was upon him. He flung up his right arm, felt the bear's claws tear white hot down his forehead, through the sleeve and the flesh underneath it, then into his chest. He pitched backward, and the bear, a suffocating weight on top of him, into spinning blackness. When he woke at last, it was 3 days later. He was in a crow lodge, and all around him were the sights and sounds and smells of a strange new world, one which was to become his own. Jim's thoughts broke off abruptly as an alarm sounded. Back in that always vigilant corner of his brain, he froze, finding his eye riveted on an angle of hill and sky visible between two branches. He knew that he had seen a split second of what might have been movement there. For perhaps a count of 60, he stood motionless, bringing every faculty of his mind to bear on the matter. An animal that far away and upwind need not concern him. It was not a white man. Seasoned mountain men were the only whites who would be wandering this country in mid-October and still alive, and they would be heading away from these mountains towards the plains and the winter lodge. That left Indians. By the end of his 60 seconds, Jim had arrived at the probable location of every tribe in the Northwest, modified their positions with regard to the season, the present threat of snow, and probable state of their larders, and the last reports of their activities and mode. He moved on, puzzling over why a lone Digger Indian, or at the most 2, should be scouting so far from their village on the banks of the Snake River at this time of year. When Tom got back from setting his traps on the other fork of the stream, he'd mentioned the matter. Jim reached the camp before full dark. A quick glance told him that all was well, even before his gaunt, wolf-like dog, Moccasin, who always slept with one eye open, came wriggling out from beneath a bush to meet him with a flurry of tail wagging and panting. There was Tom's horse, Tucky, and Buckskin, his own half-wild, cream-colored crow mare, both standing half-hidden behind a clump of willows near the stream. It took longer to locate the mule, whom Jim had named Wakicha, bad medicine, for a very good reason. There was not the slightest sign of him. Jim stood quite still, scratching Moki's ears and whistling tunelessly under his breath, searching the nearby thickets. He stared for seconds at an irregular dark spot between two clumps of leaves before he realized he was looking directly into the mule's long-lashed, inscrutable eye. He grinned, walked over to the cache of firewood he and Tom had collected earlier in the day, and selected 4 small logs which he arranged like the spokes of a wheel. With a handful of dry twigs, flint and steel, he soon had a blaze going. Still whistling softly, he took a kettle from his pack, which, like all mountain men, he thought of as his possibles. Filling the kettle at the creek, he set it simmering over the fire on an improvised tripod. A good chunk of buffalo hump, a handful of the dried wild onions he always carried, and a section of beaver tail went into the pot. Then he sat down and stretched his legs to the fire, feeling the warmth slowly creep through the soaked leggings and moccasins. Moki padded toward him, yawning, and dropped down at his side, stretching his nose out on his forepaws, but keeping his yellow eyes on the boy. "You feelin' lazy, good for nothin'?" You lazy good for nothin', Jim said. Moki's tail thumped ingratiatingly. His eyebrows moved as his yellow gaze went briefly to the fragrant steam starting to come up out of the kettle, then back to Jim's face. He began to drool. Jim grinned, stood up, and turned his backside to the flames, holding first one foot, then another to the comforting warmth. "Wah, too lazy to hunt even," he drawled. "Where's all the rabbits? Rabbits, Moki." Moki emitted a low, enthusiastic growl, but didn't move, except his tail thumped a little faster. Jim reached down and rumpled his ears, then walked over to rummage along among his possibles for his other pair of moccasins, his awl, and a length of deer sinew. He also dug out a chunk of meat, which he threw to the dog. "There, you thieving coyote. Tomorrow you hunt for yourself or you go without, by Gor." Taking the heavy-bladed knife from his belt, he hacked a tab of fringe off one of his sleeves and settled down cross-legged by the fire, began to mend the split moccasin with the tab of deerskin and sinew. As he worked, his low, tuneless whistle mingled with the dog's snarling and slavering over the meat. Lonesome, thought Jim. Wished Tom would get back. What'll it be like when he's gone south? Here I'll be, with only Moki and Buckskin and that cussed mule, and never anybody to talk to. Didn't used to get lonesome. What ails me? It's 'cause the beaver's all gone. That's what's done it. Makes a body feel like the ground's caving in all round, like everything's sliding away, and there ain't no solid place to step no more. I best go home to Abskaroka and get busy fightin' Sioux. He jabbed the awl through the tab and through the moccasin until he had a row of holes, and then began to thread and split sinew through them, binding the patch in place. The smell of meat cooking and the sight of his fingers handling the sinew made him think of Red Deer, his crow mother, whose seamed and cheerful face was the first thing he'd seen when he woke up in the new world of the teepee that morning. All he'd really been conscious of at first was the pain in his body, the strange, stiff feel of the muscles in his right arm, and the smell of meat and herbs simmering over the fire in the center of the lodge. Then he'd noticed other smells too, dog smell and smoke smell and the smell of fresh scraped hides and blood. Something else, very pungent and strong, that he realized finally was the odor of the wet, sticky poultice someone had bound around his naked chest and his arm. It was made of some kind of leaves that he had never seen before. He looked again at the old woman in the vivid skirt, crouching there by the fire, and her face crinkled suddenly into 1,000 seams as she smiled at him and nodded, her black eyes bright as a sparrow's. She was working at something in her lap. In a moment she finished and held it up, a necklace of blue beads and long, curved, yellow-white claws strung upon sinew. He gazed at it, uncomprehending, as she rose and came toward him. She was still nodding and grinning, pointing first to the necklace, then to his chest, all the time repeating something over and over in a language he did not understand. Gradually it dawned on him, those cruel ivory curves dangling among the beads were the claws of the grizzly, the same claws that had ripped open his flesh and all but taken his life. Revulsion swept him, and he jerked away from the woman, pressing his cheek into the rough hair of the buffalo hide under his head. The sudden movement sent flame and ice streaking through his wounds, and for a moment he sank once more into blackness. When he came to himself, the woman was fastening the necklace around his throat. He lay there rigid, fighting off nausea at the feel of those talons, cold and heavy against his flesh. After a moment, as they warmed to the heat of his body, he lifted his left hand and touched them. Slowly his fear evaporated. A kind of triumph took its place. The bear was dead, but Jim Keith was alive, very much alive. He turned his head again, looking at the woman. She was watching him closely, and her brown, crooked finger pointed across the teepee to a fresh hide stretched over a flame. The fur was rough and black in color, each hair tipped with silver, so that was all that remained of his enemy. The brute had come to a sorry end, for all his might, all because of 11-year-old Jim Keith, who had killed him with one shot through his red and wicked eye. He looked back at the woman and suddenly laughed aloud, gripping the necklace and feeling a fierce joy spurt through him. He was glad the bear had died, glad he had killed him, gloatingly proud of that splayed hide and the talons dangling from his neck, and his own valor. The joy was his first step towards savagery. He took many more in the months and years that followed. During the tranquil, shadowy weeks of his convalescence, the lodge became home to him. He lay on his bed, buffalo hide stretched on a willow frame, drowsing or watching the fat, furry puppies, one of whom was Moki, tumble over each other in the sunshine near the entrance, or listening to red deer's tales of the little men, or the warriors of long ago and great medicine dreams they dreamed. He had soon learned her guttural language, learned, too, that when a crow hunting party had discovered him barely alive under the grizzly's body and brought him to their village, she claimed him in place of her dead son. Sometimes in those first months, he had been lonely and longed to run away to his uncle. Then he would turn a deaf ear to Red Deer's stories and talk in English aloud to the puppies, or even to rocks and trees, from pure homesick craving to hear it once more. And Red Deer, half jealous, half compassionate, had named him Talks Alone. But as his wounds healed, his life grew more active and his memories less so. He joined eagerly then with the other boys in their rough and dangerous games, tugged constantly at his hair to make it grow long and luxuriant, like that of the proud warriors about him who often worked switches into their braids until they trailed to the ground and had to be doubled back in glossy coal-black loops. Scalp Necklace, the graven-faced old chief who was husband to Red Deer, had also accepted him as son, and saw to it that he learned all a chief's son should know: how to pull a bow, how to bear pain or joy if necessary, without the quiver of an eyelash, how to steal a horse from under an enemy's nose and ride him as a feather rides the wind, how to hunt, how to stalk, how to drum his heels in dances, how to keep his scalp. And in his 14th year he achieved the first goals every Crow boy must achieve. He counted coup, won honors in war, earning the right to wear the eagle feather, and dreamed his own medicine dream. After that, no memories ever plagued him. He talked only Crow, and thought only Crow, and was only Crow. Then one day in his 16th spring, nearly 6 years after the bear's attack, a group of warriors rode back to the village, telling of a party of Long Knives, white trappers they had found camping without gifts or palaver or permission in Absaroka country. 3 Crow braves had gone under in the hostilities that followed. But here were 2 of the Long Knives' horses, their rifles, and their scalps. Something happened inside the boy as he watched one of the warriors, curve setting proudly on his beautiful cream-colored mare, waving his coup stick, from which a long scalp dangled. It was no longer Absaroki Talks Alone, but white-born Jim Keith who stood there, shaking with sudden anger. His own mother's hair had been that color. Her face, lost to memory for years, now filled his mind. After that, all was changed. It was not enough to win coups and paint himself and be a crow. As the weeks passed, he grew thin, with longing to see white faces like his own, and hear a civilized tongue, and sit again by a trapper's campfire, while the stars came out over Jackson's Hole or the Popo Egi. He thought about it until he could think no longer, and had to act. One night he crept alone out of the lodge that had been his home for 6 long years. He took only a few treasures, his weapons and Moki, and ignoring his own horses, counted coup one last time by cutting the beautiful mare, Buckskin, from the very lodge of the warrior who had flaunted the blonde scalp. She carried him southward over the plains and the wild hills, back to Taos and the world of the white trapper, a world which now, 2 years later, he knew was crumbling under his feet. Jim jerked a sinew through his moccasin. As he did so, he saw Moki's ears go up briefly, then down again. At once, his every sense snapped alert. He began to grin, though his fingers never stopped their calm work on the moccasin. With one elbow, he loosened the sheathed knife at his belt, and his muscles gathered. The tiny rustling of a leaf gave the signal. One lash of his supple body brought him to his feet. His wrist flicked and the firelight glinted on the flinty steel blade as he melted into the bushes. Tom Rivers' familiar laugh rang out from the clump of the cottonwoods by the stream's edge. He emerged, his shoulders shaking, and yanked Jim's knife from the tree trunk 1 inch above where Tom's head had been a second before. "It was a tie again, you knife-throwing coyote. I ducked afore it hit." He walked toward the fire as Jim, still grinning, went back to his scattered sinews. "By golly, I'll sneak up on you someday," Tom went on, tossing Jim his knife. "Done pretty well this time. Got to within 30 feet of you afore you heard me." "Wah! I set around 5 minutes waiting for you to come into range. You're getting old, Tom." "Say, listen, hoss. I was strolling in and out of double-guarded Blackfoot camps afore you cut your teeth. I'll get old when I get ready, and not afore, you hear? What's in the pot?" He leaned over to sniff the steam, grunted appreciatively, then settled to the business of drying his soaked legs. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, slow-smiling and easy, but dangerous as a rattlesnake, as plenty of Blackfeet and Sioux had found out, and as quick-moving as any man needed to be. Even aimed to kill, that knife could never have hit him. Jim liked him better than any white man he knew. You could trap and ride and hunt alongside Tom Rivers and never say a word from sunup to dark if you didn't want to, and still you never felt alone. The fact that Tom was in his 50s and Jim barely 19 had mattered to neither of them these many months they traveled together though the amiable bickering about it was a nightly ritual. The camp would be mighty lonesome soon, Jim thought. With the night closing down like this, and the fire brightening and pot bubbling, and no Tom standing there angling his long legs one way or another, while his leggings dried from the wet, dark red to faded scarlet. As if he had read Jim's mind, Tom said, "Reckon I'll be heading south tomorrow." Tomorrow? Jim's heart sank as he fastened the last sinew on the moccasin. "Wah! You'd best get your old bones into warmer weather," he murmured. As Tom grinned, he added, "Goin' to Taos? Maybe not. Kinda hankerin' to see Californy for onct. Anyways, I'll happen by the Nez Perce country fust to get my squaw loose from her relatives. Tired of mending my own shirts. Never marry an Injun boy. They got too many relatives." Jim got up to toss the moccasins back into his pack, concealing his surprise. He'd never known Tom had an Indian wife, but then he and Tom had never asked questions of each other, and there was no sense starting now. Instead, he remarked, "I reckon the meat's done." He ripped 2 slabs of bark off a nearby cottonwood, and they piled stew on them. Tom filled his mouth with beaver tail and spoke around it. "Looky here, boss. Why don't you come on with me? To Nez Perce country? Not much." "Why not?" Jim jerked a thumb towards the eagle feather stuck in his hair. "I earned that stealing Nez Perce horses." "Shucks, ain't nobody gonna scalp you for a little thing like that. I thought it was Sioux you was so unpopular with." "Sioux, Blackfoot, Nez Perce, all the same." Tom laughed. "All right then, meet me in Californy." Jim hesitated, then shook his head. "I reckon not, Tom." "By golly, you're a stubborn—" He broke off, his eyes snapping with Jim's towards the thicket, where Bad Medicine had suddenly scrambled to his feet. The mule was facing south, his long ears cocked forward, trembling slightly, every muscle tense. "Digger scout, I think," Jim muttered. "Saw something earlier." He set aside his bark plate and reached for his rifle, as did Tom. As they rose silently, Moki stiffened and growled, and Buckskin raised her head, muzzle dripping from the creek. The mule was always the first to be aware of danger. "Moki, guard," snapped Jim quietly. The dog bounded out of the circle of light to crouch threateningly in front of Buckskin, blocking her way. Tom had already faded into the trees where Tucky was tethered, and Jim leaped for the for the thicket at the other side of the clearing, turned the mule half around, and got behind him. He was not seriously alarmed. Diggers were nothing when you were used to Sioux and Blackfeet. And if he had been right about that flash of movement on the hillside earlier, there were only a couple of them, but live trappers were careful ones. "What in tarnation are them coyotes doing so far from home?" came Tom's annoyed mutter. "I want to finish my meat." "Dunno. Ain't nobody on the war trail that I've heard of." The whole thing was puzzling. Well, no matter. They'd find out soon. Jim primed the flintlock's pan, cocked it, and filled his mouth with extra bullets. Then he slanted the gun barrel over the mule's back and waited.